Let's move away from the rail now and look at the debt profile, which is expected to be in the neighborhood of about 50 trillion naira if the current attempt by the federal government to obtain more loans turns out to be successful. According to new National Development Plan of 2021-2025 unveiled by President Muhammadu Buhari last week, the federal government is planning to borrow between 12 trillion naira between now and 2023. As this will push country's public debt stock to 50.2 trillion naira by 2023. Domestic debt at 28.75 trillion naira and external debt at 21.47 trillion naira. The borrowing framework is in the plan is 45% each for both foreign and domestic borrowing, while the other financing sources accounts for 10%. In 2021, the federal government planned to spend 3.32 trillion naira to service its outstanding debt, which is higher than the 2.95 trillion naira budgeted in 2020. As Nigeria's debt profile continues to rise, the big question begging for answer is what is the impact of these loans on the economy and by citizens? To profile this, I introduced him earlier. He's the CEO of Cowry Assets Management Limited, Mr. Johnson Chukwu. Good afternoon, Mr. Chukwu. Compliments of the season, and it's good to see you.
Good afternoon, Tolu, and thank you for having me. Happy New Year in advance.
Yes, and how is the East?
Well, the East has been very calm. The section of the East where I am, which is Abia State, which is Wake in Abia State, is very calm, very peaceful. People are in celebration mood. You need to see the way the Easterners migrate home every Christmas. The community is full of all citizens from home and abroad. We're all having fun here in the Southeast. Good,
really good to hear. That's a good one, Mr. Chukwu. Now, our debt burden, I know we've been over this, we've talked about this before now, but this is really scary to me. Between now and 2023, we are looking at another 12 trillion naira, and that's within the projections of the National Development Plan of 2021 to 2025. Mr. Johnson, please give us an expert view of how does this really come to you?
Well, Tulu, like you said, you are concerned that we are accumulating debt at such a rate. I'm also concerned, and I believe a lot of Nigerians are concerned at the rate at which Nigeria is accumulating national debt. The challenge is not actually that we are accumulating national debt or increasing our national debt. The challenge has always been that the amount the government is borrowing is not reflected in capital goods, in capital assets. You really can't say, I can look at the number of highways have been built, the number of standard gauge rails have been built, the seaports have been built, the airports, that you can point your hand and say, look, this growth in debt can be attributed to capital build-up so that it will catalyze quicker and more efficient economic activities. Unfortunately, we are getting to a point where we'll be borrowing to service debt, and that's a concern Nigerians have had. Some of us have actually advocated that we should review our strategy for funding government, funding infrastructure, and bring in private capital. We really can't afford to continue to grow our debt profile at the rate we are going, given the weakness of our revenue, of the federal government revenue or government revenue.
I'm also looking at debt service to revenue, which would remain at about 80% in 2022. Your thoughts about these two, Mr. Johnson?
Okay, if you look at that, I mean, that's already symptomatic of a country that's over-leveraged. If Nigeria was to be a corporate citizen and it uses 80% of its total revenue to pay for interest on debt it had borrowed, where will you have money for basic social goods, healthcare, education, other social facilities, security? Where will it have money for infrastructure development? And you can see clearly that by the main mention of that we'll be using 80% of our total revenue to service debt, shows clearly that at this point our debt has gotten to a not sustainable level. I mean, you don't need to be an economist to agree with me on that. If as a family, your household income, you spend 80% to pay interest on the money you have borrowed, what will you use to pay your children's school fees? to pay your rent, to feed the family. So we're getting to that point where we will not need to borrow. In fact, as it stands today, there is no kobo that Nigeria spends on capital expenditure that is coming from revenues of the government. Every kobo we spend on capital expenditure is borrowed, which means currently the borrowing or debt service is crowding out critical investment in sectors of the economy that we need to make investments in. So clearly, that's already symptomatic of a country that's over leverage or a country that's already suffering from debt overhang.
Let's look at now that aspect. You know, I was talking to the CEO of NRC earlier, and we're talking about that aspect that Nigerians, or some will argue, that no nation will develop without borrowing because of infrastructure issues, because of economic development, and all of that. So, one way, some try to justify these borrowings.
Well, that's the position of the government. Let me put it this way. Ideally, there's nothing wrong with borrowing as long as you are borrowing for capital goods, for investment in critical sector of the economy. The investment you are borrowing to make should be such that the return on that investment or the cash flow from that investment should be enough to pay back the amount you have borrowed. If you borrow and you are not able to realize enough cash flow from the amount, the investment you made with that borrowing, then you have a problem with paying back the loan. And that's the situation we have in the country. So the situation we have now is that we're not even borrowing to really put on infrastructure. If we borrow 10 billion, for instance, maybe 2 billion will go into infrastructure, 8 billion will go into consumption. So you find out that little amount we're investing in infrastructure is not enough to generate enough cash flow to pay back the debt. So that's the challenge we have. And what he said, the key thing about managing your physical framework or managing any country's economy, you manage your economy according to your peculiarities. Nigeria's peculiarity is so that we have weak revenue profile. The government does not generate enough revenue as to be able to pay for debt service or to pay some of the expenditures. In other countries like America are highly leveraged. But look at the government revenue in those countries. We have a unique situation and we have to really redefine our fiscal framework in tandem with our unique situation. What is tax revenue to government revenue? It's less than 5%. Unlike what they have elsewhere. What is total federal government revenue? Last year, the federal government revenue was less than 5 trillion naira. And this year, we are talking of 18 trillion naira in budget. So you are projecting close to 12 trillion naira as revenue, which is not feasible as it stands today. So if, for instance, we have to borrow, and we can come up with a framework that says all borrowing must go into critical infrastructure. And I mean, when I talk of critical infrastructure, I'm talking of critical, commercially viable infrastructure that can expand the capacity of the economy to be a productive economy, to produce goods and services, so that in the near future, the government revenue will grow as a result of the investment we made in infrastructure. But that's not the case we have today. So be that as it is, the appropriate thing to do is to review the way we are funding certain infrastructure like the rail lines and bring in private capital. One of the things I have advocated repeatedly is that the Nigerian government and government in most part of the world are not the most efficient utilizer or deployer of economic resources. They are not the most efficient manager of economic resources. Let's leave that to the private sector. If we must borrow to build the standard gauge rails, why don't you concession those standard gauge rails to private sector and let them borrow and build it? Because they're going to build at a far more cost-efficient level than the government will do, because in government procurement there are a lot of wastages. The private sector procurement is more efficient, and therefore there will be a lot of savings. Efficiency is instituted in the private sector structure, unlike what they have in the public sector. So for that reason, the government of Nigeria should not continue to borrow to do infrastructure because we are not doing it efficiently.
Let's look at IGR now. It comes to my mind that how well are we looking at generating more internally generated revenue at this time? Well, that's part of taxation that you mentioned. But something that also pricks me is the issue of cutting expenditure, fiscal sustainability, even across sub-nationals and all of that. Do you see this also helping us to reduce our borrowing?
Okay, let's start from the issue of government revenue or internally generated revenue of the government, both at the federal and state levels. As it stands today, the federal government gets most of the revenue from corporate taxes, custom duties and custom duties and excises, and revenues or income from members of the armed forces. Excuse me. So what that means is that the government revenue is dependent largely on the size of productive activity in the economy. If the productive activity in the economy shrinks, then the government revenue will also shrink. As it stands today, our GDP is not expanding as much as it should. You have about 33.3% of our population of our labor force that are unemployed. That population would have been a source of revenue for government if they are employed. You have 98 million people in Nigeria that are in extreme poverty, so they are not taxable. Were they working and earning income, it would have been a source of revenue for the government. So you find out that despite the size of our economy, despite the size of the population, the government is not able to mine the size of that population because you have abject poverty. And that's one of the reasons why the government revenue is weak. If you have a prosperous economy, I mean, look at Elon Musk said he paid $11 billion in taxes in 1 year. So compare that to the total revenue of the federal government of Nigeria. That's one person's income tax. So if you have an expansive economy, if we really structure economy so that businesses will strive, business will make money, the government will be able to tax those businesses. But unfortunately, if your economy is growing at 1%, 2%, the businesses are struggling to survive. And therefore, their revenues are weak and the government subtracts the revenues. So you have to recognize in the context of it that we have weak economic activities and government revenue depending on those economic activities. As long as they are weak, government cannot increase tax revenues. If the economy begins to grow at 3, 7, 8, 10%, then the businesses will prosper and the government will earn more revenue. But that's not the case today. So the government really cannot effectively increase its tax burden without taxing those people who are paying to debt.
Now, finally, before I let you go, Mr. Johnson Chukwu, we expect the president to put pen to paper on Friday for the 2022 budget, and many will say, yes, it's timely, coupled with the fact that, like experts will say, it's been accompanied by the Finance Act. What are your expectations, the assumptions, and all of the projections?
Well, let's start from the assumptions. Some of the assumptions are quite realistic. If you look at the crude oil price target is realistic. Crude production, we may struggle with the volumes they have indicated because we've seen weakened crude production as a result of breaching of pipelines. You saw that Shell declared force majeure a few days ago because of issues around Focado. So we need to address the issue of crude production to be able to attain some of the revenue projections. And I also think the revenue projections holistically overall are quite optimistic. I don't see how the government will generate the kind of revenue they are projecting. But aside from that, in terms of expenditure, the government has always strived to meet their expenditure provided they are able to borrow until the government can access. We have been discussing the issue of borrowing. The challenge we have today is that if the government should continue to borrow to meet the projected expenditure this year, like you said, we are going to have a debt overhang that subsequent government will struggle to be able to even survive, to operate effectively because they wouldn't have any leeway to even pay salaries and wages of public servants, talking of building infrastructure. So those are the challenges we have. We have an assumption of a expenditure projection that is extremely unrealistic because the government will not have the revenue to support that. Because we are still going ahead with a flawed fiscal framework, which is the government will build infrastructure from budgetary allocation when the revenue of the government is weak. We need to address that orientation and revise it to bring in private sector to build some of this infrastructure. If we do that, we're going to have a slim budget, but effective budget that will focus on basic social goods.
Well, it's a good way to live. It's always interesting talking to Mr. Johnson Chukwu, and time really flies. Mr. Johnson, let's do this in 1 minute. The market trading will also be on Friday. That will be as we move into the new year. What are your expectations too along that line? I'd like to hear your views.
Come again, Tolu.
I'm talking about trading at the exchange. The last trading for the year will be Friday. What are you thinking?
I think it will be largely flat. Many people that wanted to take position will begin to take position in the new year for the benefit season that will start around February, March. So the last days, you're going to see institutions unwinding to invest in treasury bills. So, but for private, for retail investors, I think they're going to largely trade flat. So I think if I expect it's flat trade.
All right there. I must thank you so much. Just had a nick of time. Thank you so much, Mr. Johnson Chukwu, the Chief Executive Officer, Cowry Assets Management Limited, who joined us live from Abia State. We really appreciate this and do have a happy new year, and we hope to see you in the new year.
Thank you for having me.
All right there.